It's over a week ago since we had the single largest deployment of the emergency alert system to date. Well, I myself didn't experience this personally because I'd actually switched that feature off on my phone quite some time ago. But nonetheless, millions of people received the alert. Many of my friends and colleagues have commented on it and said how it sort of made them jump, it surprised and shocked them. And it's, of course, been covered a fair bit in the news. Well, in this video, I want to explore two key issues. Firstly, what's actually the role of the state? And secondly, what's the historical context around this emergency alert system? Well, if we consider briefly the first question, and we'll come back to this throughout the video, what's the role of the state? Well, if you were to go back and have a look at Thomas Hobbes's book Leviathan from 1651, then the argument was that in order for a civil society to exist, you first had to ensure that there was some sort of security in place. And so it followed that in order to get security in place, you needed a relatively strong state that had got coercive powers to ensure that law and order were maintained. If you were to compare and contrast that with John Locke, in his book Two Treatises of Government from 1689, then there's a bit of a different view as to what the role of the state is. For John Locke, the state, yes, it needed to offer some degree of protection, but it was much more limited than that suggested by Thomas Hobbes. So the state envisioned by John Locke was much more constrained and restricted. And then if you were to have a look at, say, John Stuart Mill, in his book On Liberty from 1859, then what we see is the introduction of the so-called harm principle. The idea being that some degree of coercion might be necessary in order to prevent harm being inflicted upon other people. So when we're looking at the emergency alert system, we're really looking at it within this sort of spectrum as to how much power should the state have and when should that power be used. And so in order for us to get a little bit of a sense as to where we might sit within this argument, we'll take a look at the historical context around emergency alerts or warning systems. Now, the history behind these goes back many, many hundreds of years. Off the top of my head, you might look at, say, 1588, the year of the Spanish Armada, and of course back then the English coastline is dotted with a series of beacons, the idea being that you'd have people manning the beacons and keeping a lookout over the coast, and at the sign of the Spanish Armada they'd light the beacon, and that would actually transmit the message all the way through to Elizabeth I's government, and they would know that the Armada was on its way, had arrived, and that they needed to mobilise. But in terms of the emergency alert system that we are familiar with today, I would suggest that the origins of it are kind of rooted in the emergence of aerial combat, of the prospect of civilians being attacked by some sort of foreign adversary from the air. And the first time that happened in this country was in January 1915. And in January 1915, we actually see Great Yarmouth being attacked through a Zeppelin raid, which of course had been launched by Die Fliegertruppen der Deutsche Kaiserreiche, or the German Imperial Flying Corps. And it's during the First World War that we see the government really beginning to try to create some sort of organisation or service that could alert people to an impending attack and to sort of take certain precautions against it. And so we actually see its Major General Edward Ashmore is tasked with heading up the design and implementation of this type of service, and it became known as the Metropolitan Observation Service. And this was developed and refined throughout the First World War, although it wasn't, I suppose, not fully effective and operational until later into 1918. But nonetheless, the work of the Metropolitan Observation Service would go on to inform later systems and later work. And in 1924, the Committee of Imperial Defence formed a subcommittee called the Air Raid Precautions Committee. And this would do a lot of work in terms of looking at what was needed to prepare for an aerial attack of some description. And in 1937, we actually have the Air Raid Precautions Act being passed. And through this legislation, the government required local authorities to begin implementing measures such as installing air raid sirens, having air raid wardens, making sure that there was some sort of provision for bomb shelters and such like. And of course that remained an important part for how Britain coped with the Blitz throughout the Second World War. But by the time we get to 1945, the threat has begun to change somewhat. By 1945, as a result of the USA dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the threat has become even more significant, especially by 1949, once the Soviet Union had developed its first atomic bomb. So we're into the nuclear age. And of course, by the early 1950s, Britain had developed its first nuclear weapons, and we were beginning to see the emergence of the hydrogen bomb and different sorts of missile systems. And in 1953, there was the concept of the 4-minute warning, which was this estimated length of time that it would take for some sort of attack to be launched from the Soviet Union for it to hit Britain. So it wasn't exactly pinpoint accurate in terms of time, it was just rather an approximate length of time that it was expected that it would take for a Soviet attack to hit Britain. And by 1957, we have the United Kingdom Warning and Monitoring Organisation operating alongside the Royal Observer Corps. And by 1962, we have the system known as HANDEL being established. And this involved around about 250 major control points, many of them police stations. And these would transmit messages to thousands of other locations, the idea being to get an authoritative message of a credible attack through to as many people as quickly as possible. And HANDEL remained in operation up until 1992. Now, of course, throughout the that Cold War period, the British government issued advice and guidance on what to do in the event of a nuclear attack. And this included things like, preparing your own bomb shelters, stocking up on food and water and that type of thing. Of course, the question remained, well, firstly, how much use would that actually be in the event of a nuclear attack? And also, in light of the so-called 4-minute warning, what realistically would most people be able to do in 4 minutes if there really were some sort of a nuclear strike about to happen? But nonetheless, this is exactly what was going on in Britain. This is what the British government was doing. And by 1982, we see Britain upgrading HANDEL. We're seeing WB 1400 equipment being installed. And this was different to earlier equipment used in the system, precisely because it was designed with the greater knowledge and understanding of the electromagnetic effects of a nuclear blast. But of course, it's somewhat ironic that as Britain was beginning to sort of roll out this upgraded infrastructure, the Cold War was actually starting to wind down. In 1989, we of course have the fall of the Berlin Wall, and by 1991, the Soviet Union had collapsed. HANDEL stood down in 1992, and much of the infrastructure around it was actually dismantled. Not completely, bits of it survived in local areas, but as a national system, it was largely dismantled. So this actually marked, I guess, the end of that phase of the history of the warning and emergency alert type of system. So the next phase in the history of Britain's warning systems was really 2004 with the Civil Contingencies Act. And this shifted to an all-hazards resilience model. This could include anything from, say, terrorism to extreme weather through to serious failings with infrastructure and so on. And from 2013, the British government began experimenting with mobile phone alerts, although the first national test didn't happen until 2023. In March 2023, the emergency alert system is actually rolled out, and then in April, that's when we get the first national test. And this was designed to be compatible with 4G and 5G, with the idea or the theory being that this would reach as many people as possible. Now, of course, the first national test of this system revealed a number of problems. Firstly, there's apparently quite a few people did not actually receive the alert, for example, and secondly, the other issues which people in government hadn't thought of began to rear their ugly heads. So, for instance, people who were victims of domestic abuse may very well have been carrying secret phones, and of course, by having this emergency alert system being sent out, it would of course ping those phones, and people committing the abuse would suddenly realise that their victims had actually got some sort of secret phone, and that could actually put the victims in considerable danger. And that's actually an issue which also reared its head again in this last week. But nonetheless, that's when we have the first national test of the system. Now, throughout 2024 and into 2025, there were a few instances where the emergency alerts were used. So, for example, in February of 2024, there was an unexploded bomb from the Second World War that was discovered in Plymouth. And this system was used to evacuate around about 10,000 people. It's kind of somewhat ironic that this emergency alert system was being used to deal with a problem that went back to the Second World War. And then we also, of course, had the emergency alert system being used for things like Storm Dara and Storm Airwin. And then we get to 2026 with the emergency alert system being used because of the apparent risk of wildfire. So the history of Britain's warning systems is very, very interesting, not only in terms of the technological development of those systems, but also in terms of the rationale for which those systems are developed and used. So we start off with warning systems being developed in response to the prospect of conventional bombing in the First and Second World Wars. We then move to warning systems being developed in response to the risk of a Soviet nuclear attack. And then in the 21st century, we see the warning systems shifting to this all-hazards resilience model. And yes, that does include terrorism, or warning people about the prospect of terrorist attacks. But as we've seen recently, it also includes the prospect of an emergency rather than there being an actual emergency in your vicinity. And this potentially raises various issues itself. So yes, you could argue that warning people, oh, don't light a barbecue because you might cause a fire, and that you might argue that that actually fits in with John Stuart Mill's harm principle. The idea being that yes, we'll change people's behaviour to prevent harm being inflicted on other people. But then, on the other hand, through going down such a road, we're also seeing the issue develop of greater state intrusion and greater state interference. And if one begins to deploy an emergency alert system to everyone, irrespective of whether everyone is facing an emergency in their vicinity, then you could very well create alert fatigue. And this is, what you might call the cry wolf effect, where, people perhaps become desensitized to this emergency alert system. And as such, there is the possibility that in the event of a genuine emergency that genuinely does affect or could genuinely affect the whole country, then you might very well get people who just ignore it. And that could actually lead to greater casualties and deaths and so on. And so this does raise that question: how much intervention and interference should the state have? And I leave you people to discuss that amongst yourselves. By all means, leave your comments below. I'll take great interest in reading those. And thank you very much for those of you who've watched my other videos and liked and subscribed. It is very much appreciated. And if you've enjoyed this video, and hopefully you have, if you found it interesting, you've liked it, please do like and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next one. Do have a good day, and I'm going to enjoy this cup of tea. So I'll see you all next time. Cheerio.